In the sweltering summer of 1962, a young doctor in rural Tennessee stepped into a delivery room and froze. The scene before him was so disturbing that 3 nurses had already walked out. On the table lay a man, barely conscious, his body gaunt and hollow from an impossible 14-month pregnancy. And in the corner, a covered bassinet that no one dared approach. What had been born that night wasn't simply a child. It was the final product of a century-long genetic gamble, a bloodline that had deliberately folded in on itself generation after generation, ignoring every natural warning sign. And now, nature had answered back. What followed over the next 72 hours would be sealed in government archives, scrubbed from county records, and whispered about in local bars for decades. Because what came into the world that night might not have been entirely human. Before we dig deeper into this chilling story, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the dark hidden chapters of history we uncover here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow all around the world. Jeremiah Hartwell arrived in the Tennessee mountains with nothing but a mule, a rifle, and an idea that would shape the next century of his bloodline. He was determined to create something enduring, something unbreakable. The mountains offered seclusion, a place where outsiders rarely ventured, and where a man could build a world in his own image without interference. Jeremiah saw this isolation not as a burden, but as opportunity. He purchased 3,000 acres of rugged land, built a rough log house with his own hands, and began carving out a small kingdom. Every tree he felled felt like laying foundation for legacy. To Jeremiah, wealth meant little if it could be divided among strangers. He watched neighboring families lose farms when sons married outsiders, splitting land and weakening bloodlines. He swore that would never happen under his watch. He gathered his 3 sons around the fire one winter night and spoke of lineage as though it were scripture. Blood, he said, was the only thing a man could truly control. The eldest, Thomas, listened intently. He was quiet, broad-shouldered, and fiercely loyal. He would become the first piece of Jeremiah's plan, a marriage not to a stranger but to his own cousin. It was a choice that shocked neighbors, but Jeremiah dismissed gossip as ignorance. He believed that purity of blood would create strength, that the future of the Hartwells depended on keeping their heritage intact. By the spring of 1830, Thomas wed his cousin under the sloped roof of the family cabin. It was a union less about romance and more about design, a calculated step in Jeremiah's living experiment. The family celebrated with a single barrel of corn whiskey and a feast of venison. Jeremiah looked at the young couple with pride, believing he had secured the first link in a chain of perfection. The first children were born within 2 years, 4 sons who grew strong on mountain air and hard labor. Their laughter echoed through the valley like a promise that Jeremiah's vision was taking root. 3 more sons followed, though not all would live past childhood. Mountain life was harsh, and Jeremiah considered each loss not tragedy, but test. The weak being culled to strengthen the line. He began keeping journals, recording every birth, every death, every small quirk of temperament. He wrote by lamplight, convinced that one day others would see the precision of his work. Neighbors who passed through the valley noticed how seldom the Hartwells visited town. The family dealt in grain and timber but never stayed to socialize. Outsiders were tolerated only long enough to trade. By the 1850s, the Hartwells owned not only land, but 2 grain mills and a sawmill. Their laborers were hired men, but every decision, every record, every profit stayed in Hartwell hands. Thomas grew into a stern but capable patriarch, continuing his father's plan. His sons were paired carefully with cousins, each union chosen with the intent of concentrating the family stock. One of Thomas's middle sons, Samuel, became the family's record keeper. A quiet man with a precise mind, he turned Jeremiah's journals into medical-like ledgers, documenting births, illnesses, and even unusual physical features. Samuel married his own cousin and urged his brothers to do the same. He believed they were cultivating something special, something more refined with every generation. It was no longer just family. It was experiment. Visitors to the homestead sometimes remarked on the children's striking similarity, their pale eyes and tall frames. Samuel would only smile, taking such comments as proof that the bloodline was becoming more distinct. In his journals, Samuel noted every anomaly: extraordinary memory, unusual strength, or unexplained fevers. To him, these were not warnings, but signs of progress, evidence that the Hartwells were shaping destiny. He wrote of one son who could predict when storms would break hours before clouds gathered, another who could solve mechanical problems beyond his age. These gifts seemed to Samuel like nature's confirmation, yet he also recorded the darker signs: fevers that nearly killed infants, temperaments that turned violent without warning, and minds that sometimes drifted far from reality. Still, he pressed forward with determination. Samuel built a larger home on the highest ridge, overlooking the valley. It was fortress-like, a place where the family could live apart from prying eyes and continue its work undisturbed. By now, the Hartwells had become a rumor among neighboring townsfolk. Men in taverns whispered of strange weddings and children who rarely appeared in schoolhouses. Some called them proud, others called them cursed. Samuel paid no mind to gossip. He saw the family's isolation as essential to its mission. The outside world could corrupt what they were building, and he would not let that happen. Each birth was greeted with solemn ritual, Samuel writing in his ledger before the child's first cry had faded. He considered these records sacred, a chronicle of mankind's attempt to perfect itself. The family's influence grew as they supplied grain and lumber to the region. Their power was quiet but undeniable, and their secrecy only deepened the mystery surrounding their name. Samuel's journals from the late 1860s began noting subtle changes: elongated limbs, heightened sensitivity to light, peculiar fixations. He called these refinements, believing the line was nearing something remarkable. The Civil War swept through Tennessee, but the Hartwells remained largely untouched. Their isolation shielded them, and they sold provisions to both sides, further enriching the family's holdings. When soldiers passed through the valley, they remarked on the strange, pale children watching silently from the porches. No one ever saw them play with outsiders, and no one dared approach uninvited. By the end of the war, the Hartwells stood stronger than ever. The land was theirs, the mills were theirs, and their blood remained pure, as Jeremiah had once demanded before that long-ago fire. Samuel felt he had fulfilled his grandfather's vision, but he was restless. He believed the next generation must push further, that the true breakthrough was still ahead, waiting to be born. He encouraged his sons to marry quickly, pairing them with cousins before outsiders could lure them away. Love was irrelevant. Only the continuation of the line mattered, only the perfecting of the stock. The family tree had begun to twist tightly, branches folding back on themselves until the outside world could barely distinguish one generation from the next. To Samuel, this was triumph. As the 19th century drew to a close, Samuel's ledgers filled with dense, careful handwriting, each line a step closer to what he believed would be a perfected man. He never questioned the cost. The valley grew quieter as the Hartwells withdrew completely from county gatherings. Outsiders no longer asked questions. They had learned there were some hollows better left alone. Samuel passed the journals to his eldest son with strict instructions. Keep the records, continue the unions, and never let strangers break the chain. The experiment was no longer one man's dream. It was destiny. The young man nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the task. To him, the family's future was not merely survival. It was conquest of nature itself, a defiance of the ordinary. Somewhere deep in those mountains, under the shadow of ridges and the whisper of pines, a blueprint was being drawn, not by chance, but by deliberate will. The Hartwell bloodline was only just beginning. The Hartwells entered the late 19th century as a family apart from the world. Their valley was a kingdom, their blood a fortress, and their name a warning whispered by neighboring farmers over quiet suppers. The mountains deepened their isolation. Roads washed out every spring, leaving the family cut off for months at a time. They considered this a blessing, a natural wall protecting their carefully shaped legacy. Samuel's eldest sons became the stewards of the land, clearing more ground, planting more fields, and expanding the mills. Their work was relentless, their discipline absolute, every task performed with ritual precision. The children of this generation grew tall and rangy, their pale hair and light eyes setting them apart from neighboring farm boys. Outsiders noticed the resemblance, but dared not speak of it aloud. Every birth was still recorded in the great leather ledger Samuel had kept. It had become both scripture and laboratory record, a chronicle of bloodlines turning tighter with every passing year. When a boy was born with a crooked spine, Samuel's eldest son wrote only one sentence: "Nature has misstepped. We will correct her in the next pairing." The boy did not survive the winter. The family viewed misfortune not with grief, but with calculation. Loss was a reminder that the experiment must continue. Each marriage was chosen with increasing care, cousin to cousin, nephew to uncle's daughter. Neighbors noticed that Hartwell men no longer came to barn dances or county fairs. They sent hired hands to sell grain but kept to themselves, their great house on the ridge glowing at night. Rumors spread of children who rarely spoke in public, who seemed to understand things far beyond their years. Some swore they could read a man's thoughts by simply looking at him. By the 1870s, the family's land stretched unbroken from one ridge to the next. No fences marked the borders, but every hunter in the county knew not to cross without permission. The younger sons built cabins higher in the hills, closer to the clouds. They wanted distance even from each other, as though the isolation itself was a form of purification. In these cabins, children were raised without outside company, taught by fathers and uncles rather than schoolmasters. Their education was practical, focused on numbers, planting cycles, and the careful study of family records. Samuel's grandson began adding his own observations to the ledger. His handwriting was fine and sharp, describing not only births and deaths, but behavior, illnesses, even strange dreams, the boys reported. One entry from 1876 described a boy who refused to sleep indoors, claiming the walls pressed on his skull. He lived in the yard for 3 summers and grew stronger than any of his brothers. The family saw such oddities as proof of progress. The bloodline was changing, refining, producing sons who seemed in tune with forces the outside world could neither see nor measure. Yet alongside these marvels came darker notes. Fits of rage struck some boys without warning, leaving splintered furniture and bloody knuckles. The family contained these outbursts in silence, never calling for town physicians. Visitors who did come to the ridge felt uneasy. Something in the air seemed too still, the children too watchful. Men left quickly, glad to get back to noisy towns and ordinary folk. By 1880, the Hartwells had become something more than a family. They were a closed system, a self-sustaining experiment running quietly in the hills while the rest of the country marched toward modernity. Railroads came through Tennessee, bringing strangers and commerce, but the valley remained untouched. The family discouraged travelers with curt warnings, letting the outside world pass by without leaving its mark. Samuel's grandson believed they were approaching the threshold Jeremiah had imagined. He wrote of the bloodline becoming concentrated enough to produce something rare, perhaps even a new expression of mankind itself. School teachers who attempted to educate Hartwell boys often quit within weeks, claiming the children unnerved them. Their pale stares, their uncanny memory, their strange silences made ordinary lessons impossible. The family eventually stopped sending boys to school at all. Education would be handled privately, shaping them not into townsmen, but into instruments of the great experiment Jeremiah had begun. Farmers in nearby hollows began warning their sons not to play near Hartwell land. Stories grew of eerie chanting heard at night and lights that moved through the woods without torches. Whether true or not, such stories only reinforced the Hartwells' desire for distance. They wanted no contact, no dilution, no interference from the noisy, careless world beyond the mountains. In 1885, a severe winter killed cattle across the county. The Hartwells survived with grain reserves carefully calculated years before. Other farmers took note but received no help. Charity was considered wasteful. This coldness cemented the family's reputation as proud, perhaps cursed. To the Hartwells, it was simply survival, the necessary discipline to protect a bloodline they believed would one day transform humanity. When Samuel's grandson fathered his first son, he wrote in the ledger that the boy's gaze was piercing, his grip stronger than other infants. He took this as an omen of the future. Each new generation brought stranger signs, children who spoke late but then recited long passages of scripture from memory, boys who could find lost animals by following what they called whispers in the wind. At night, the great house rang with debates around the fire, uncles and cousins arguing about pairings, calculating which marriages might bring them closer to perfection. The future of the line consumed every discussion. The mountains kept their secrets, and the Hartwells grew further from ordinary men. They believed themselves not cursed but chosen, carrying forward a torch the outside world would not understand. As the century closed, the family ledger was thicker than a Bible, its pages filled with measurements, observations, and predictions. The Hartwells considered it their true scripture, the map to a future only they could see. Travelers passing through sometimes glimpsed pale figures on the ridge at dusk, standing motionless, as if listening to something in the wind. By morning, they were gone, leaving only footprints in the frost. The outside world crept closer with each passing year, but the Hartwells withdrew deeper into the mountains, determined to finish what Jeremiah had begun, no matter the cost. They had ceased being merely farmers or millers. They were keepers of an experiment, guardians of a bloodline they believed could change mankind, or leave it behind entirely. Their valley had become both cradle and crucible, forging sons who were stronger, stranger, and further removed from the common mold with each passing season. And somewhere in those cold ridges, under winter stars and summer storms, the line was winding tighter still, preparing to cross a threshold that would astonish even the men who had shaped it. Ezekiel Hartwell was born under a violent summer storm that shook the rafters of the ridge house. The family ledger noted it as a sign, a herald that the bloodline was entering a decisive phase. Unlike his father and grandfather, Ezekiel grew restless within the valley. He would climb the ridges alone, staring for hours across distant peaks as though waiting for some unseen signal that only he could hear. He wrote in secret journals, not the formal family ledger, but personal notes filled with feverish handwriting. In them, he claimed the bloodline spoke to him in dreams, urging him toward completion. The cousins whispered that Ezekiel rarely slept. At night, he wandered the halls, muttering calculations of kinship, scribbling family trees by candlelight until his fingers cramped. He seemed possessed, driven by an urgency no one else felt. When Ezekiel married his cousin, the ceremony felt less like a wedding and more like a ritual. He spoke his vows as though reciting an oath to some unseen tribunal watching from the dark woods. The children that followed were unlike those before. They cried little, stared too long, and displayed abilities that unsettled even their fathers. One could memorize entire books before speaking his first full sentence. Another could sit silently for hours, seemingly aware of distant events. When a neighbor's barn burned in the night, the boy was already awake, rocking slowly, whispering, "Fire is coming," hours before flames appeared. The family took these signs as triumph, proof that the concentrated blood was unlocking hidden potential. Ezekiel recorded each incident with elation, certain that the experiment was on the verge of its greatest breakthrough. But darkness crept in with the triumphs. One son flew into sudden rages, destroying furniture, injuring cousins, then collapsing in exhaustion. Another refused to eat for days, claiming the food was poisoned by outsiders. Ezekiel's letters from this time show a mind fraying under pressure. "The blood calls for perfection," he wrote. "We must finish the work, no matter the cost, no matter what is lost." Neighbors grew wary. They spoke of seeing pale boys wandering the ridges at night, staring into the sky, never speaking to travelers. Some said they felt watched even when no one was there. By the turn of the century, Ezekiel's household had become a place of silence and strange discipline. Outsiders were forbidden to enter the house. Births were attended only by family, recorded in secret. The county doctor visited once and never returned. He described the children as unusually sensitive, unable to tolerate daylight without pain. He urged medical study, but Ezekiel dismissed him and barred further visits. Photographs from this era show children with elongated faces, wide, unblinking eyes, and thin limbs. Their posture seems unnatural, as though they were uncomfortable within their own bodies. But Ezekiel saw beauty in them. He expanded the family compound, building additional cabins and a great hall for gatherings. The walls were covered with diagrams of ancestry, drawn with obsessive care, charting every union and predicted outcome. At night, Ezekiel would stand before these diagrams, touching them as if they were sacred maps. His sons watched him silently, absorbing the weight of his obsession and the destiny he demanded they fulfill. By 1910, the Hartwell line had dwindled to a handful of surviving males, but those who remained were considered exceptional by the family. Their intellect was striking, though their behavior grew more detached. Farmers in town stopped mentioning the Hartwells entirely. The name had become an omen. When livestock went missing or strange sounds echoed through the hills, men would cross themselves and lock their barns. Some claimed Ezekiel's eldest son could predict deaths. He would sit by the fire and quietly name which neighbor would be gone by spring, and too often, his words proved true. The family ledger became less a record and more a prophecy. Ezekiel wrote not just of births, but of what he believed each child was destined to become, as though he could see their future unfolding. One boy died after refusing food and water, staring into space until his heart failed. Ezekiel recorded the death not as tragedy, but as a necessary sacrifice to purify the line. Cousins began to fear Ezekiel's demands. Some tried to leave the valley but were brought back by brothers who believed escape would contaminate the bloodline. The mountains themselves seemed to hold them prisoner. Storms lashed the ridges one autumn, killing livestock and flattening barns. But the Hartwell compound stood untouched. Ezekiel saw this as a sign they were favored, that nature itself protected their purpose. During gatherings, Ezekiel would speak of the coming child who would surpass them all, a being born of perfect union who would complete the century-long work. His eyes shone with feverish conviction. The younger men followed his instructions without question, marrying cousins, recording outcomes. They had been raised to believe this was destiny, that the world outside the valley was decaying while they were ascending. But the cost grew higher each year. Infant deaths rose, tempers flared, and some sons were born unable to speak or walk. Ezekiel insisted these were simply missteps, precursors to the final perfection. In his last letters, Ezekiel wrote of hearing voices even while awake. He claimed the bloodline whispered which pairings must occur next. His handwriting became jagged, as though his thoughts were too rapid to contain. When Ezekiel died, he was buried on the highest ridge under a standing stone. His journals were locked away, but his sons swore to complete what he had begun, even if it destroyed them. After his death, the compound grew quieter still. The men walked like sentinels, pale and watchful, their speech clipped and formal. It was as though Ezekiel's obsession had seeped into the very soil. Photographers who passed through were turned away. No new images of the family were captured, as if they no longer wished to leave evidence that they had ever existed beyond the mountains. Strangers who camped near the valley sometimes reported hearing chanting late at night, deep voices carrying through the trees. No one ever saw the singers, but the sound left travelers shaken and sleepless. By the outbreak of the First World War, the Hartwells were a closed society. Young men registered for the draft, but none served. Medical examiners reported them unfit, though the reasons were never disclosed. County officials suspected influence, but let the matter drop. No one wanted conflict with the Hartwells. Their wealth and land gave them power, but their strangeness gave them something even more potent: fear. The surviving brothers continued pairing sons with cousins, creating unions so mathematically tight that family trees now looked more like circles. Each birth was a gamble that might bring them closer to the promised child. In town, people spoke of the valley only in whispers. No one hunted near the ridges. Some swore the deer avoided the place entirely, as though the woods themselves knew something unnatural was unfolding there. By 1920, the family numbered just a dozen men and boys, but Ezekiel's dream had not died. They believed they stood on the edge of revelation, that the next generation would decide everything. The valley waited in stillness, the air charged with expectation. Whatever came next would not merely shape the Hartwells. It would test the limits of what could still be called human. When Ezekiel's surviving son Morai took control of the compound, he carried the burden of prophecy on his shoulders. He was not merely head of the family, he was custodian of its final experiment. Morai was a hard man, forged by decades of Ezekiel's unrelenting discipline. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were commands, and every cousin and nephew obeyed without hesitation. The 1930s brought hardship across Tennessee, but famine and foreclosure never touched the valley. The Hartwells had stores of grain, livestock, and gold hidden under floorboards. To them, the outside world's suffering meant nothing. Morai paired himself with his first cousin in a union planned since their birth. This was not marriage as the outside world knew it. It was mathematics, the closing of a genetic circle. When the valley learned of the match, no one dared protest. Even the younger cousins, who whispered doubts, fell silent in Morai's presence. His stare could wither a man where he stood. The pregnancy was unlike anything the family had seen. It stretched far beyond normal months, leaving the young mother pale and bedridden. Morai considered this a sign that the bloodline was reaching culmination. He recorded every symptom in the ledger, his handwriting a mix of clinical detail and reverent prayer. He believed this child would be the one to bring Jeremiah's dream to completion. When the child was born, the family gathered in near silence. His head was large, his limbs long, his eyes wide open within moments. Morai held him aloft, like an offering to the mountain sky. The boy was named Jeremiah after the patriarch. He was watched constantly, measured and weighed weekly, as though the entire history of the family was balanced on his narrow shoulders. Jeremiah grew unnaturally fast. By the age of 3, he had the height and strength of a boy twice his age. He spoke rarely but observed everything, his pale eyes following movements like a hawk. Dr. Weiss, a German physician living in the area, was persuaded to monitor Jeremiah's growth. He kept detailed notes, astonished at the boy's rapid development and strange neurological responses to ordinary stimuli. He noted that Jeremiah could solve mechanical puzzles instantly, recognized complex patterns before being taught, and displayed bursts of strength that startled grown men. Yet he recoiled from touch and could not bear loud voices. Morai interpreted this as proof of success. The family whispered that Jeremiah was becoming something beyond ordinary men, a being meant to lead them into a future no outsider could share. When Jeremiah reached adolescence, Morai kept him within the compound at all times. The boy never went to town. never saw other children. He lived in a world entirely shaped by the experiment. The cousins were instructed to serve as companions, but Jeremiah tolerated them only briefly. He preferred solitary walks through the woods, returning with strange sketches of plants and animals no one else noticed. One evening, during a thunderstorm, he repaired a broken generator by touch alone, never having been taught its workings. Morai saw this as divine confirmation that the bloodline had produced its masterpiece. The ledger recorded Jeremiah's progress like scripture. Morai wrote of him as if describing a prophet rather than a son, calling him the vessel through which the Hartwell's purpose would be fulfilled. But alongside the triumphs came shadows. Jeremiah suffered what Dr. Weiss called neurological storms, periods of violent convulsions followed by days of silence. He would not eat, would not speak, staring through walls as if elsewhere. These episodes frightened the younger cousins, but Morai refused outside help. He believed such suffering was the price of progress, that perfection demanded sacrifice from the body as well as the soul. By the time Jeremiah turned 20, Morai decreed it was time for the final pairing. He chose a second cousin, herself the product of generations of intermarriage, completing the last step in the plan. The young couple were brought together in the great hall under lamplight. There were no witnesses beyond family, no celebration, only the solemnity of destiny being fulfilled. Morai's face remained stern throughout. The pregnancy that followed defied every rule of medicine. It lasted 14 months, exhausting the mother until she lay skeletal and still, her body barely keeping pace with the thing growing inside her. Dr. Weiss visited often, documenting the case with increasing alarm. His notes described bone structures forming too quickly, organs developing on an unnatural timeline, as though the child was following instructions unknown to mankind. Morai forbade talk of fear. He believed this was the final step, the creation of a being that would embody everything Jeremiah had once promised in firelight a century earlier. Each week, the compound grew quieter. The cousins moved with reverence, speaking only in whispers. They believed they were standing on the edge of something holy, something that might end the world they knew. The day of the birth came under a shroud of rain. Thunder rolled across the mountains as the family gathered in the hall, their faces pale with expectation, dread, and awe. Dr. Weiss described the delivery as unlike anything he had ever seen. The child was impossibly large, his skull translucent, his eyes open before he drew his first breath. Within hours, the infant was tracking movement around the room, responding to sounds at impossible frequencies. Morai knelt beside the cradle, tears streaming down his face, believing he had witnessed creation made new. But Dr. Weiss saw something else, an intelligence that seemed detached from all human warmth. The child did not cry, did not seek comfort, only stared with unblinking focus at every man in the room. Morai ordered the windows sealed, the lamps dimmed. He declared the child must be kept apart from the world until they understood what they had created. The cousins obeyed without question. For 3 days, the child lived in silence, except for the rustle of sheets. The men watched in shifts, unsettled by its calm, sensing that it was studying them more than breathing. On the 3rd night, without warning, the child went still. There was no struggle, no gasp, only a sudden absence. Dr. Weiss pronounced death, though he could find no cause beyond exhaustion. Morai buried the infant on the ridge at dawn. The family stood in the rain, heads bowed, knowing something irreversible had passed. The experiment had reached its end, but no one spoke the word failure. That evening, Morai sat alone by the fire, the ledger open on his knees. He wrote a final line: "The bloodline has reached its limit, and nature has rendered her verdict." From that day, the compound felt hollow. The cousins moved through their work like ghosts. The great experiment that had consumed 5 generations had ended, leaving silence where ambition once burned. The mountains, too, seemed quieter. Hunters reported fewer animal calls, as though the valley itself was holding its breath. Something had changed, something that could never be undone. Morai locked the ledger away, never to write in it again. The book that had guided the family for a century now sat closed, its final page heavy with failure and destiny denied. Those who survived the season rarely spoke of the child again, but deep down, every man knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The bloodline had produced its final heir, and in the long, cold nights that followed, some swore they could still feel the child's unblinking gaze in the dark, as though the mountains themselves remembered what had been made and unmade within them. Jeremiah Hartwell grew up in a valley shaped by silence. His birth had been greeted not with celebration, but with grim determination, as though every man knew his life would decide the family's fate. He was watched constantly, measured with precision, his every action recorded. From the beginning, it was clear he was unlike other children. His mind raced ahead while his body matured at alarming speed. By age 3, he spoke in full sentences, read from the family Bible without being taught, and asked questions about the stars that left even the older cousins unable to answer. Dr. Weiss returned to observe him regularly. His notes describe a boy whose intellect outpaced his years, whose senses seemed tuned to a higher pitch, but whose emotions remained strangely distant and flat. Jeremiah disliked touch, flinched from sudden sounds, and often stared into the distance for hours, as though listening to voices only he could hear. He seemed both present and entirely elsewhere at once. His strength startled those around him. At 5, he could carry loads meant for grown men, yet he handled them delicately, as though aware his power might crush what he touched. Morai kept him inside the compound, fearing the outside world would not understand. Jeremiah's lessons were taught by uncles and cousins, who sometimes found themselves unnerved by the boy's silent, assessing gaze. He seemed to know when men lied. During lessons, he would stop them mid-sentence, shaking his head, refusing to continue until the truth was spoken aloud. This earned him a strange respect and fear. At night, he dismantled and reassembled tools without instruction, leaving them improved. Once, he repaired the grain mill's broken gearing by touch, claiming he could feel the pieces showing him where they belonged. The family interpreted these feats as signs the bloodline had succeeded. Morai wrote in the ledger that Jeremiah was proof the generations of sacrifice had not been in vain, that the line had reached its peak. But there were shadows in the boy's brilliance. He rarely smiled, never sought comfort, and reacted violently to changes in routine. If interrupted, he would scream until collapsing into hours of catatonic silence. Dr. Weiss warned that such episodes could damage the boy's mind, but Morai refused treatment, believing they were necessary storms. He said greatness was being forged and could not come without fire. By adolescence, Jeremiah's talents had grown uncanny. He could memorize entire books in hours, predict weather changes with accuracy surpassing seasoned farmers, and solve mechanical problems faster than the adults who had trained him. He also began to withdraw further. Meals were eaten alone, conversations limited to brief, precise exchanges. The cousins whispered that being near him felt like standing before something ancient and not entirely human. One night during a lightning storm, Jeremiah walked barefoot into the rain, standing for hours with arms outstretched. When asked why, he said simply, "I was listening." No one dared ask what he heard. Morai believed Jeremiah's destiny was to sire the next generation that would perfect the bloodline. He arranged a pairing with a second cousin, a union calculated to tighten the genetic coil one last time. Jeremiah did not resist. He agreed with an unsettling calm, as though he had known this would come since birth. The wedding was private, silent, except for the crackle of the hearth fire. When the pregnancy was confirmed, Morai's relief was palpable. He told the cousins the line was nearly complete. that the final child would reveal whether the experiment had succeeded or if nature would reject them forever. As months passed, the household grew tense. Jeremiah spent nights pacing the halls, muttering equations under his breath, drawing diagrams on walls that no one could decipher. He seemed both anxious and certain. Dr. Weiss grew alarmed as the pregnancy stretched beyond normal limits. He begged for hospital care, but Morai refused, declaring the child must be born on Hartwell land, under the same roof as its ancestors. By the 12th month, the mother could no longer rise from bed. Her skin was pale as paper, her hair falling out in clumps. Jeremiah sat beside her silently, eyes fixed on her swollen belly. When the 13th month passed, the cousins began whispering of curses, of omens, of the bloodline turning against itself. Morai silenced them with a glance, refusing to allow fear into the halls. Jeremiah seemed untroubled. He spent hours carving strange symbols into wood, arranging them around the room as though preparing for something only he understood. Dr. Weiss noted this behavior but received no explanation. Finally, in the 14th month, labor began. The delivery was excruciating, requiring every man to hold the mother still as the child was brought forth. When it was over, silence filled the room. The newborn's head was too large, its limbs too long, its eyes already open. It looked from man to man as though taking inventory of who stood before it. Some cousins wept, others backed away. Jeremiah stood motionless, expression unreadable, then turned and left the room. He would not look at the child again. Morai called this a test of strength, but some believed Jeremiah saw something he would not name. For 3 days, the child lived, showing abilities no newborn should possess. It tracked movement, turned toward voices, and seemed to study its surroundings with eerie intensity. It never cried, never sought comfort. Then, on the 4th morning, it stopped breathing. Dr. Weiss attempted revival, but failed. He wrote in his notes that death came not from illness, but from something deeper, as though its design had completed. Morai buried the child at dawn, refusing ceremony. Jeremiah watched from a distance, his face unreadable. That night he burned the wooden symbols he had carved, watching the flames with hollow, unblinking eyes. Afterward, Jeremiah withdrew entirely from the family. He stopped speaking for days at a time, spending hours in the forest, returning only after nightfall. The cousins avoided him, whispering that he carried the shadow of the dead. Some claimed he began writing a separate book, not the family ledger, but his own account. None were allowed to read it, but they saw him filling page after page with cramped writing. Dr. Weiss noted that Jeremiah's brilliance had not diminished, but his humanity seemed to recede. He called him a man walking at the edge of human experience, perhaps beyond it altogether. By age 25, Jeremiah had become the silent guardian of the compound. He kept the cousins in order, repaired every machine, hunted game with uncanny precision, and yet seemed entirely separate from them. When strangers wandered too close, he would appear on the ridge, watching until they left. No one dared confront him. His presence alone was enough to turn travelers back toward safer ground. Morai grew old and frail, leaving Jeremiah to lead the family. But Jeremiah no longer spoke of the bloodline's future. The experiment was over in his mind, its final result written in silence. When Morai died, Jeremiah buried him on the highest ridge beside Ezekiel's stone. He did not call the cousins to witness. He dug the grave alone, his silhouette stark against the rising sun. From that day, Jeremiah rarely entered the house. He spent nights in the woods, returning only to maintain the compound. The cousins followed him still, but they feared him more than they loved him. Some say Jeremiah remained there until the government men came years later. Others believe he disappeared into the mountains, taking his private book and leaving the valley to grow silent forever. Whatever his fate, Jeremiah 5 was the final living expression of a century's experiment. He was brilliant, terrible and lonely, a man whose mind had reached beyond what most could bear. And in the quiet valley he left behind, only the wind remained to tell of him, carrying whispers through the pines like a memory the mountains themselves could not entirely forget. The summer of 1962 came heavy with heat, the valley cloaked in haze. The compound stood silent, its walls weathered, its halls nearly empty. Only a handful of men remained to witness the last chapter. Jeremiah was no longer young. His hair had gone silver at the temples, his shoulders carved by decades of work, his eyes hollow from years of solitude. Yet he remained unyielding, watching everything. Rumors had spread of another birth, one last attempt to push the bloodline beyond its limit. Few spoke openly, but every man knew this child would decide whether the line ended forever. The months dragged on with agonizing slowness. The father kept vigil day and night, writing in a private journal no one was allowed to read. His face was grim as though he expected calamity. Dr. Weiss, now an old man with shaking hands, returned for one final duty. He came to the compound quietly, carrying his worn leather bag, determined to see this through even if it broke him. The pregnancy stretched longer than any he had seen, 13 months, then 14. The expectant father walked the floors at night, muttering, carving symbols into beams, praying to the ridges themselves for strength. When labor began, the compound fell silent. Every man stood outside the birthing room, heads bowed, listening to the distant sounds of struggle and muffled commands. No one spoke, not even to comfort each other. Hours passed. Thunder gathered over the valley as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. When the child was delivered, the men outside knew by the sudden stillness that something extraordinary had occurred. Dr. Weiss emerged pale, drenched in sweat. His voice shook as he said the child lived, but his tone was not triumphant. He warned that what lay inside was unlike any life he had seen. The father stepped forward first, entering the room alone. The others waited, listening to the faint creak of floorboards and the whisper of wind through the shutters. Minutes passed before he called them in. What they saw defied expectation. The child lay silent, staring at them with eyes too large for its face, unblinking as though it recognized every man who had gathered to witness its arrival. Its skull was elongated, its limbs unnaturally thin, its fingers jointed twice where normal men had one. The cousins exchanged uneasy glances, feeling both reverence and terror in the presence of the newborn. For 72 hours, the child lived, observed, and seemed to observe them back. It tracked every movement, turned toward whispered voices, and startled at sounds no ordinary ear should have been able to hear. The men took turns watching through the night. Some swore they felt their thoughts examined under that gaze, as though the child was not merely alive, but already deciphering the world it had entered. Dr. Weiss wrote constantly, his notes filling pages. He admitted privately that he had never feared a patient until now. He believed the child was not simply human, perhaps not meant for this world. On the third night, the child's breathing slowed. The men gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dim light as though waiting for judgment. No one moved until the breathing stopped entirely. Death came suddenly, quietly. There was no struggle. It was as if the infant had completed whatever purpose had brought it here and simply chose to stop living. Dr. Weiss pronounced it gone. The father carried the small body alone up the ridge at dawn. He buried it under a cairn of stones, each one placed carefully until the grave stood like a silent monument to the experiment. When he returned, he did not speak. The compound felt hollow, every step echoing as though the walls had grown cavernous overnight. Even the wind outside seemed to avoid the valley. Within days, men from the state arrived. They came in dark cars, wearing plain clothes, asking questions but giving no answers. They carried crates into the house and removed every record they could find. Dr. Weiss was forced to sign papers swearing silence. The cousins were scattered, sent to distant towns, some given new names. The compound was purchased under shadow corporations and declared restricted land. Bulldozers arrived weeks later. The Great Hall was torn down, the Ridge House burned to its stone foundation. The valley where generations had lived was cleared until no trace remained of the Hartwell name. The grave on the ridge was left untouched. Perhaps the men feared to disturb it, or perhaps they wanted one reminder of what had been wrought here, a marker for history that would never be told. Jeremiah disappeared soon after. Some said he was taken by the men in dark cars. Others claimed he walked into the mountains one last time and never returned. Either way, he was never seen again. Dr. Weiss lived long enough to write a private account. In it, he confessed he believed they had created something beyond humanity, something the world was not ready to receive, something nature had rejected. He wrote that the child was both magnificent and terrifying, a mind behind those eyes far too awake for a newborn, as though it had arrived carrying knowledge rather than innocence. The valley was eventually fenced, marked as Federal Wildlife Preserve. Locals avoided it. Hunters said their dogs refused to cross the boundary, howling until dragged back toward safer woods. Some swore they saw lights on the ridges at night or heard voices chanting when no men lived there. Others claimed the land itself hummed, a low vibration that set their teeth on edge. Over the years, the story became legend. Men in bars spoke of the cursed family that vanished, of a child too strange to live, of government men who erased an entire name from history. But the mountains do not forget. The cairn still stands, moss growing between the stones. Travelers who find it report a feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes still measure their presence. Scientists sometimes whisper of the Hartwell case, citing it as a warning about the dangers of genetic concentration. But most records are gone, leaving only fragments, enough to fuel speculation, but never prove anything. The final child remains a mystery, a question carved into the bones of the valley. Was it failure or transcendence? Did the Hartwells destroy themselves, or did they glimpse something beyond humanity? Men who walk the ridges say the air still feels heavy, as if the ground remembers. Perhaps some experiments leave echoes that can never be silenced, no matter how many records are burned. The Hartwell bloodline is gone, but the questions it raised remain. How far can men bend the code of life before it breaks? How much ambition can the human frame endure before shattering? Perhaps the answer lies under those stones, in a ridge grave no one dares to open. Or perhaps the answer lies in the silence that still rules the valley after all these years. The story ends where it began, in the mountains, under a sky too wide for comfort, with a family's dream turned into warning. Some legacies are not meant to be celebrated but remembered, and if the wind sounds strange when it moves through those ridges, if the trees seem to whisper at night, perhaps it is only the final child reminding the world it once existed.